What's up, Resonate? Good to see you guys. I'm excited about where we're going today. Hey, real quick, before we get into some stuff, I want to, into some serious stuff, I need to tell you some even more serious stuff, if that can even be possible. A couple weeks ago, I told you that our home was invaded, and our home was invaded specifically by mice, and that we're engaging in a war, and I just wanted to give you an update. I know that you've been just praying for this, and this has been on your mind. But right now it's about 7 to, I would say 0.5. So we have 7, the mice have 0.5. And so with the 0.5, let me tell you this. Basically what happened is one of the mice took one of the traps with them, and I think that is really, really brave. I think that's courageous. So I awarded a 0.5 for the mice. So I'm just being real even and clear. But we are decisively winning this war, and in this, as we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, the whole point behind this thing is that, and the reason I even share this is this idea that there's all these things in our life that we put a lot of effort into getting out, and we begin to try to figure out how do we take and remove mice. They're a nuisance. We don't want them in our house, and so there's been some great effort that we have taken to eradicate the mice from our house, and yet the irony is this, is that there's nothing destructive about having mice in your house. But there is some things that live in our hearts, and oftentimes, here's the thing, that we do not put the same attention into our hearts, even though that there's some things that reside, there's creatures, there's things that lurk in our heart, and when they come out, they wreck our lives. And oftentimes, this is the reality, that we were taught to be able to manage our behavior and to manage our words, but never to manage our hearts. And this is really just a powerful thing. In some research for this series, I watched the movie Inside Out. I don't know if you've heard of the movie Inside Out. It's a brilliant movie, but it really just it paints this incredible picture about what's going on in our lives behind the scenes or under the surface. There's this control panel, right? And there are these emotions that are fighting to control, right? And they have these levers, right? And they'll take those levers, and all of a sudden there's a response that happens. And this is what's happening in our hearts. This is what's happening in our lives, and we don't even realize it sometimes, that we're responding to some stuff. We're reacting to some stuff, and we don't even know why we're doing it. We don't know where that comes from, but we try to figure out how to deal with it. And here's what Jesus says. Instead of just trying to deal with all the junk that's lodged in your hearts, we need to root it out. We need to identify it. And so he says all of those behaviors, they start in thoughts. And that's kind of, for us rational beings, the thing, oh, I had a thought. But Jesus says there's one other step that we need to understand, that there is a heart that precedes a thought. And those emotions get stuck in our heart. And that heart ultimately changes our destiny. And so we've been talking about this. This is week 4 of a 5-week series. We're going to do one more. We're going to do our last one on jealousy. And so you're going to want to come back. It's probably my favorite out of all these things as we talk about this. In this, as we begin to understand what it is, we go back to this truth. The wisest guy who ever lived, a guy named Solomon, basically searches for this one fundamental truth that everything in life can be kind of pointed back towards, and we can say, if we do this, everything will work out. And here's what he comes up with. Proverbs 4:23, it says this: above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. I want you to really get this truth. If you don't listen to anything else, if there's nothing else that lands, if you would just basically take this. And so here's what I want to do. I want us to just all say this verse, read it off the screen together, because I think it's that powerful for us just to articulate this so that it begins to get into our hearts. So let's say it. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. I hope you believe that, because that is some truth that will transform your life. And so here's the thing, as we begin to get into these emotions, here's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk to you about an emotion that lives very, very deep and hidden in your life. Something that is really beneath a lot of stuff, and yet it is a driving force for us, and a driving force that we don't even recognize. There's all kinds of decisions that we make. There's all kinds of things that we do that are connected to this emotion. And it's even hard to label it an emotion, but this is something that is, when I say it, you're going to immediately dismiss it. In fact, this is one of those things that no one really believes that applies to them. So here's the sermon for us today. I'm going to preach a sermon for your friends, right? So just think through this truth, and just, when you have friends, maybe you can just say, hey, I can apply this to someone I know. So the sermon is not to any of us, because I've never heard someone say that this emotion or this thing characterizes them. And this is what it is. It's greed. We hear about greed. And we hear, and kind of we process this, and we think, oh, maybe I should be a little bit more generous. I'm sure there's room for me to be a little bit more generous, but I'm not greedy. In fact, I've never had someone come to my office and say, okay, Pastor, okay, Keith, here's the thing that I need to figure out. I'm walking through some stuff in my issues and walking through some stuff in my life, and I think I figured it out. I think that the problem is that I spend too much money on myself. Never in the history of my ministry has that ever happened, right? No one has ever said, hey, I've got a greed problem. And this is one of those things that we can't even see. It's the most hidden of all the emotions. In fact, it's often camouflaged as a good virtue, because what the Bible labels greed, we oftentimes can say, hey, I'm just being careful, right? I'm just being a good steward of the things that God has given me. I'm just protecting what I have, right? And so oftentimes, this is one of those things that we kind of never get to see in the mirror. In fact, this is a sermon that many people don't want to hear. This is a sermon that's even hard to preach, because it's a sensitive topic, and it's revealing something to us that we don't want revealed. And so we can say, man, I feel guilty, I feel angry. But really, it's really hard for us to believe that we're guilt or greedy kind of people. So let me just kind of characterize this and help us to understand why we're going there. Why are we going to make everybody uncomfortable for the next few minutes? It's this. I want you to do something. If you believe in heaven and or hell, I want you to raise your hand right now. If you believe in heaven and or hell, raise your hand. Okay. If you believe, keep your hands raised. If you believe what Jesus taught about heaven and or hell, just keep them raised. Okay. That's a good number of people here. This is good. You can lower your hands. All right. There's a lot of us here, and really polls say that there's a lot of people that believe what the Bible says about heaven and hell, and believes that what Jesus taught, as he articulates what heaven and hell is, that's kind of this normative thing for us to understand, and normative thing for us to agree about. But let me tell you this, that when we look at all Jesus' teachings and we kind of take and we kind of isolate that down to subjects, when we look at the amount of times that Jesus talks about heaven and hell, we combine those two together. Anything that's beyond this life, anything super, like all that together, right? Heaven and hell. What we see and what we find out is he speaks twice the amount of time on money and greed that he speaks about heaven and hell, right? So Jesus is spending more time in his ministry on earth trying to tell us about our money and our greed than he is trying to tell us about the afterlife, about heaven and hell. This is just, he understands us, and he understands that this is not an issue. In fact, when we begin to look at this, maybe just today, somewhere, there's going to be an opening in our heart where you can hear this, because the more wealthy we are, and I need you to know that you're very wealthy. I need you to know that you look across the globe, and you might not think that you're wealthy right now, but you are. You and I, we are the most, it's most difficult for us to hear this truth. So Jesus says this over and over, and especially we need to hear this. Here's what Jesus says in Luke 12, verses 15. We're going to be in the book of Luke, and so we're just going to peruse through this, and in chapter 12 is what we're going to focus on today. It says this. Then he says to them, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. And then he kind of clarifies. He says, because life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. Jesus, he's saying, there is a monster that is in your heart. Let me point out the monster. So Jesus does us a solid, and he says, here, let me reveal something. Watch out, exclamation point, is what Jesus is trying to say to us. That there's something that is lurking in your heart. There's something that's underneath the surface, and that thing is called greed. And this is the thing that Jesus is saying. He doesn't ever say, hey, watch out, you're about to commit adultery. He doesn't say, watch out, you're about to lust. But here's the thing. He says to us who find it difficult to look in the mirror and see ourselves as greedy people, that we have to watch out. In fact, here's the thing. When Jesus talks about sin, okay, we talked about doctrine. Let's talk about sin. If Jesus talks about greed or materialism 10 or 20 times more than he talks about any other sin, and if he says that essentially no one ever assumes that they're doing it, then here's the thing I think that we should start. We should start with a working hypothesis that it's probably an issue for you and for me. If Jesus teaches about this more than anything else and assumes that we don't see it, the working hypothesis is that maybe, just maybe, you and I might have this lodged in our heart somewhere. Okay? So this is what I'm just kind of pressing on us, right? And I know this isn't comfortable, and I know that this is sensitive, but I need us to understand what's going on behind the surface, because oftentimes when we begin to think about this, we don't see ourselves as greedy. In fact, oftentimes we think about greedy and we have some pictures in our head about what this looks like. And so I just want to run through a few pictures that somehow in our head kind of this is what greed looks like. It's not really us. I think we have some of these that we can throw up. Have you ever seen cat greed? You know, the cat hoarder kind of thing. That's disturbing, right? And so this is what we think about. You know, that's a room, right? That's really disgusting. How did that happen? We'll keep going. How did that dude collect all of that, right? How is that possible? Maybe you don't have a house, but maybe this is your car, right? And you're a car hoarder. You don't hoard cars, but you use your car for hoarding. Or maybe it comes out of your house and into the streets. Like we think this is sick, right? And we think about greed, and here's like the image, right? This clutching money. But here's my favorite picture. Yeah. Creepy, don't touch my doll girl, right? These are those things. And so maybe just instead of it in our head, we have all these pictures of what hoarding and greed looks like and what this looks like, and we can quickly dismiss this. And so I'm just going to ask you, if you'll just let us just kind of press into our hearts and reveal some stuff, that this is not the way that we're meant to live, that life is not ultimately the acquisition of possessions or the abundance of possessions, that we begin to subtly and subconsciously believe that our happiness equals the amount of stuff that we get, or the amount of experiences that we get, or any kind of things that we use to say, this is what, if I have more of this thing or this experience or this whatever, then this is what ultimately is abundant life. And so this is what we have to understand, that this is not what Jesus is saying, that is an equation that will always bring you to the wrong scenario, the wrong conclusion. And here's where we begin to understand. This is not, for some of you, if you think this has something to do with your bank account, and if there's not a whole lot in your bank account, then this automatically doesn't apply to you. I want you to know this is not a financial thing. This is not a bank account thing. This is not a static, how much, there's like this level and you have to figure out where you fit into this. This is about a heart thing. And this is where it gets really dangerous, because if this was a financial thing, we could just apply some financial principles and help us out a little bit. But this is a heart thing, and it's pervasive in our life. And greed is not just about our stuff. It's about our relationships, and it's about our identity. And this is why it's so dangerous. Here's what we begin to see this. We begin to think about kind of what qualifies as greed and how this understands. How we begin to understand this, because I still think that we have a hard time thinking that we're greedy. But let me just put some stuff out there and see if this sticks. If we were to think about what we will do and the effort that we will do to upgrade or enhance our lifestyle. So if we want to do something, if we want something, and kind of the creativity that we will use in order to get something that we want. If we say, hey, I need this, I don't have the money for this, I don't have the resources for this, so I'm going to figure out a way to do this, right? And our world, our culture has given us a ton of different ways to figure this out, but here's us being incredibly industrious as we are trying to figure out how to spend our money on ourselves. But let me think about this. If someone asks you for something, if someone asks you for a donation, if there's something that asks you to give, oftentimes here's what we do. We say, we kind of look at our finances, or sometimes we don't even look at our finances, and we say, oh, I don't have the amount of money to be able to do that. I can't do that. I don't have that money available to us. Now, whether or not we have the money available, that's not the point. I'm not trying to talk about that. What I'm saying is the amount of effort that we put to trying to figure out how we can creatively get stuff for ourselves versus the kind of effort that we put to trying to figure out how we can give to others. Let me break it to you. That's what the Bible calls greed. And this is what when we begin to have this idea that's kind of lodged in our hearts, we can look back to the effort we put to putting stuff in our houses, in our homes, in all the stuff that we spend our money on versus the amount of money and the amount of effort that we put to giving our money away. It's a crazy, crazy difference. And we begin to understand what's going on. I've heard, people say, I can't give $100 to this, but I have $1,000 on my credit card. Like you figured out a way to get what you wanted, but you're saying, I can't give $100 to this. Do we not see that this is like crazy? Do we not understand this is the normative way that we experience things, and that is greedy. And that is just us trying to figure out how this works. And here's why it's an issue. Because when we begin to understand this, it begins to permeate every part of our life. So greed is the assumption that your stuff is for your consumption. Greed is the assumption that your stuff is for your consumption. And I'm heading somewhere, right? And so just bear with me. I know this is not very fun. I know I'm like, I don't even like preparing for this, right? It's like really rough. In this, here's the core issue. The thought is, I owe me. If we believe that our stuff is for our consumption, what's behind that, what's propping that up, is this idea of I owe me, right? We've been through all this, right? Anger is you owe me. Guilt is I owe you. But in greed, it's I owe me. I believe that I'm entitled to doing this, that this is something that is due me, that I deserve this. This idea of entitlement is just pervasive in this. And that we somehow, here's where it gets really dangerous, that we believe that anything and everyone is to be used at some level to build my personal kingdom. And we begin to use our stuff and we begin to use our people when we begin to have greedy hearts and we begin to use people to get what we want. And this is incredibly destructive. I need you to see this because this has just become normative. And here's what happens is we just think, oh man, they're not a very good friend. Oh man, they just didn't last very long. And in this, you're just using people, right? And this is just the pervasive way that our society, and so we go from relationship to relationship to relationship because greed is lodged in our hearts and we use everything for our consumption. And that's the working priority in our life. And so here's this reality. There's three things that we can use to ultimately consume for our own good. Number one is treasure, your money and your stuff. So this is one of the first things. But Jesus says it's not just that there's all kinds of different greeds. And so for some of you, there's this place where you have kind of gotten to where you have more treasure than other things, like time. And so it's easier for you now to give away your treasure because your time is now more valuable to you. And that's the other thing that Jesus says, that we get greedy with our time. I don't want to do that because it'll take time. Some of you have figured out that time is the one, you can make more money, you can never regain more time, and we get greedy with our time. And not only that, there's talent. So we have treasure, time, and talent. And what we do, the things that we possess, just for our own benefit. And in this, here's the thing, when we begin to ask, are we greedy? It is not identifying which is the easiest to give, because some of you don't have any money, right? And so you're like, I have all the time in the world. I'm so generous with my time. Some of you say, man, I have more money than I've ever had in my life now, right? And so I don't want to do something that takes my time. I'd rather just pay something, right? And for some of you, like, I don't want to give effort to someone else. You hoard your effort. You hoard these things that you have been given these skills in. And for some of you, there's all these different things, right? The question is not what is most easiest for you to give away. It's what is most difficult for you to give away. And that's where you begin to see if greed is anywhere lodged in your heart. In this culture, over and over, it's helping us to say, hey, you don't have this. You need this. So everywhere around us is pointing to this. Take your treasure and put it for your own glory. But here's what Jesus says. Here's how Jesus helps us to understand what's going on. In Luke 12:33, he says this, sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. And then here's this brilliant verse. In verse 34, it says this, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. This is just powerful. Man, you might have you're here and maybe this is your first time at Resonate and you're like, a preacher talking about money, I'm checked out. Just give me 3 minutes, right? I want it to break this down for you because this is so stinking powerful. Jesus says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. I need you to get that. I need you to understand that this is so powerful. That when you want to know the condition of your heart, right? We've not been taught to identify the condition of your heart, but let me give you a peek into what is going on in the depths of your heart. If you really have the courage to look deep within and say, I want to take an assessment of what's going on, let me tell you this, follow the money trail. Follow the money trail. It is documented where your heart is. So Jesus says, here's the reality, that our money is tied to where our heart is focused. And if you want to know the condition of your heart, if you want to know where your identity, where your worth, where your desires lie, if you will just look at your bank account, and let me just press this one, or look at your schedule. And just we can begin to take an inventory. And again, no one wants to do this, but Jesus is saying, if you get to the point where you really want to do this, don't trust your emotions. Look at what you're doing with your assets. Figure that out. See, here's the reality. The direction of your life is determined by the direction of your heart. I hope we've established that, which is revealed by the direction of your money. This is what it looks like. See, here's what happens. Is that when there's something that is in your heart that you have set as an idol, and when we begin to talk about idols, this is something that you find your hope in, your ultimate salvation in, that this is the thing that will bring you happiness, that whatever it is, that maybe it's a material thing, maybe it's experience, a relationship, there's all kinds of different things that we can put our idols in if we distrust that God is good and that God will provide all of our happiness. Here's what a lot of us do. We say, yes, I want God, but I always also want this thing too as a backup plan because I'm not sure that God's going to actually provide all the satisfaction and the hope and the joy that I want in my life. So I'm going to have this thing too. And so this is an idol, and this is what we put up. And we say, I don't know if I trust God, so I'm going to trust in this thing. And what our money does is it reveals that thing. What is effortless for you to spend money on? So here's the war in my heart. The war in my heart is this, that when I see something that would help me to be able to create an idea or to gain knowledge or to be able to kind of put this into a workable model, it is like so easy, effortless for me to spend money on that thing. And there's all kinds of apps that I have on my devices that are helping me to be able to do that thing. It's like, oh, if that does it, yes, I'm going to do that because I need that, right? Because one of the identities that I have is someone who's innovating, idea creation, that kind of stuff. That's the thing for me that is so effortless. And that's the war that's going on in my heart. But for some of you, it might be image that you don't pass by that favorite clothing store of yours, right? You go in it, right? and it is effortless. And you try to figure out, how do I orient my life so that I can afford these clothes to, I need to have this haircut. I need to have all this stuff, right? Or for you to be able to say, man, if this is an experience that I need to have, like if this seems like this is a crazy experience, I'll figure out how to fund it, but it's not a yes or no thing. It's always a yes. I'm going to do this. Maybe it's entertainment. Maybe you're like, hey, if there's something exciting to do and fun to do, here's the thing. I'm going to do that. I'll figure out how to fund it later. All of us have this stuff that is kind of connected back to this reality that is deep in our hearts and what's going on. So we spend our treasure on what we treasure. You spend your treasure on what you treasure. That money is always in service to our idols, and it tells what is going on in your heart. So where your treasure is, there's where your heart is. And this is what's going on. And this is how this has happened. We believe that something's going to make me happy, and our money leads us right to it. This is the depth of what Jesus is trying to tell us about what's going on. And so maybe today, if you're here, and maybe you can kind of think, oh, there might be something to this. I'm just going to be open-minded for just a little bit. Maybe I'll talk about this to a friend, but maybe I'm just listening just for a little bit, just for me. I have a couple of things that I want to talk to you about. Maybe if you believe that maybe greed is rooted into something and we're onto something, I want to do two things. There's a truth that you need to believe, and there's a habit that you need to develop in your life. There's a truth that you need to believe and a habit. So this is where we're going. We're going to close out these kind of things. So let me start with this truth. So Jesus is saying, watch out. There's all kind of greed. This is what's going on. And then he tells a parable. This is a story. And he begins to highlight what's going on here. Hey, there's all these greeds. There's all these things that are happening underneath the surface. In verse 16, chapter 12, he says this. And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought for himself, what should I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and I'll build bigger ones. And there I will store up my surplus grain, and I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? And verse 21 says this is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God. See, as a farmer, right? Doing what all farmers do, the best practices of any farmer. But in this, what happens is there's a unique circumstance that happened. And in this, he's doing the things that all farmers that are good farmers do, but he has this bumper crop, right? He has more than he has had in the past few years. And so it's more than his barns will hold, and more than his silos will hold, right? And so what he does in his mind is he doesn't think, oh my goodness, here's what happened. That God, all of these things that happened that led this to benefit me were not actually things that I did. See, he begins to assume that all these things that happened were for his benefit. And so what should he do? He should keep all of this stuff because somehow there's a deserving, entitled heart behind that, right? So Jesus is trying to break this wide open and say, here's what this looks like. When good fortune comes your way, when something begins to expand your possessions, what you do next is revealing what heart you have in this kind of way. And so what happens is he begins to believe this. He begins to believe that he deserves and is entitled to this thing, even though as we begin to look, I mean, Jesus, this is agrarian society, but Jesus is doing this brilliant picture of what this looks like. There's no way that this farmer had anything to do with the amount of rain and the amount of sunshine and the combination of those two things that are put together in order for his crops to have this interesting and unique growth pattern that gave him more grain, that gave him more resources. That was something he had no control over. And Jesus is pointing out something that's a truth that you and I need to understand. That we believe that somehow this is an ownership thing with us. That we believe that we own these things. So let me ask you a couple of questions. Or actually, let me read you a verse first. 1 Chronicles 29:11 says this. See, yours, O God, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the majesty and the splendor. For everything in heaven is yours. Everything in heaven on earth is yours. Okay, so Raise your hand. How many of you guys own a cell phone? Raise your hand. All right. A lot of people, right? That's good. Let me read another verse. This is Psalm 24, verse 1. It says this, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it." Raise your hand if you're the owner of a laptop. Raise your hand. Okay? Sweet. Let me read this one more time, okay? Verse 24, or chapter 24, verse 1. "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it." Okay, let's do this. How many of you guys own, if you own a vehicle, like a car or a bike? Raise your hand if you own a car or a bike. Okay. One more time, let me read this. "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it." Okay, one more time. How many of you guys own a set of headphones? Not hairphones. Okay, hey, this is good. This is really good. We're growing together. Did you guys just see that? The truth is being applied to our lives and it's breaking out. Okay, so seriously though, here's the truth. Here's the principle. We believe that we are the sole owners of all this stuff, that somehow we possessed the resources that bought this thing, that we worked hard for, that's all behind the narrative. But what God is saying is that we don't understand what's going on. That we believe that we are owners when really we are just managers. Ownership and management, right? So this is what we have to understand, is that we believe that we're owners, and that's the source of a lot of greed, when He has called us to be managers of His wealth. And when we are doing this, I just want to say, this might sound strange, and this is kind of hard for us who live in free societies to understand what management of wealth is, but I need you to understand that there's people that manage wealth. And when we would, let's say I have to take my money, and I was to bring it to a financial planner, and here's what they would do, right? So I would bring them my money, and I would say, "Here's my money." And they would say, if they're a good financial planner, "What do you want me to do with this?" Right? This is the things that financial planners do. They don't say, "Thank you for giving me your money." Right? That's a very bad financial planner, right? That's called a Ponzi scheme, right? So this is like what's going on, right? So they said, "Thank you for your money. I will give none of it back." The good financial manager says, "What do you want for me to do with your money?" And this is a radically different thing, right? So when we begin to understand this, when we begin to understand this idea that we have been freed from the ownership of this and we've been given management over God's resources, it radically changes what we worry about. Now, I promise you, there's tons of worry that happen. Our hearts, right? They begin to worry about our possessions. In fact, the more possessions we get, the more worried we get, right? And we begin to have our hearts that are connected to that. But when it's a management kind of thing, right? You do your best. You want to be a good, responsible person for this management of this stuff. You don't want to just be crazy with someone else's wealth, right? But in this, it's their wealth. And it's something that's happening to them. And so when we begin to apply this, and I could go a long time on just trying to figure out how we apply this and how we understand. But when we begin to see our possessions as we're just managing it, our hearts are not tied to our phones and to our laptops and to our homes and our cars. And so when something happens to them, it's like, it's not a big deal. Man, Jesus had a really bad day today. Someone wrecked his car, right? This is a bad deal. Like, or maybe this is the reality that Jesus' car is broken. And so Jesus has not given me enough money to fix my broken car. So we begin to say, "Jesus, your car's broken. What are you going to do about it? I'm going to need some resources to fix your broken car." And so I think that there's some freedom in this. Now, you can't take this too far, right? If you get pulled over for a traffic violation and they say, "Whose car is this?" You can't say Jesus, They're like, "Jesus who?" Of Nazareth, last name Christ, something like that. Well, tell him his light's out, right? You can go too far with that, right? But here's the thing: when we begin to understand ourselves as managers, it doesn't remove us working hard for stuff and being industrious for stuff. It just removes this idea that we're responsible solely for this thing, and it removes the guilt from this. My birthday's this week, and I kind of know what's going to go on. And let me just. My kids are going to get me a present, probably, hoping. My kids are going to get me a present, but let me tell you what's going to go on with that, right? To go get that present, they're going to take my credit card to go purchase the present for me, right? So I'm going to get a present that ultimately my resources were used to buy the present for me. And I'm very, very grateful for the present, but we often know what's going on here, right? When I say thank you so much, I mean thank me so much, right? Because I bought myself a gift, but you picked it out, right? So this is this idea that's going on, and every parent knows that, right? Thanks, how much did this cost me, for this gift that you got for me? And this is just this interesting reality, but this is kind of this understanding that we are merely managers of this. And here's the other thing he says. If you begin to believe that you should just hoard your kind of stuff here, you don't know what's going on in the big picture. It's like this. If you ever traveled to another country, if you ever, you have your dollars, and you take and you exchange that for whatever is happening over there in whatever country that you're in. But whenever you come back, if you have some of that stuff that you exchanged, if you were to say, man, I'm so excited I got this, have you ever gone to a country that has a lot more numbers behind their money? You're like, I have $100,000 all of a sudden, right? And you bring that back. That doesn't ultimately, mean that you have 100,000. It means you have nothing, right? You just have paper, right? So I went to China and came back and I brought this. But why did I bring this back? Because I can take it and use it at, at the local store. I can bring it to Walmart and say, I got something for you, They say, what is that? It's very tiny, It's not even the size of $1. So in this, we have to understand, I'm taking this back because it's a souvenir, not because it's worth anything. And this is what we have to understand. Our wealth, when we begin to hoard it, we don't understand the big picture that's going on. So here's what we have to do. We have to understand that in this, there's going to be a place, there's going to be a time where we're going to have a dark experience with this, where there's something that's going to go on. If we hoard, if we have greedy hands in this, the difficulty is this, that there's going to be a moment where that gets revealed to us. And there's two pathways for you in your life. One is for you to go down the pathway and never pay attention to any kind of greed that's lodged in your heart. And then what will happen is that certain relationships, they will discover the fact that something is going on in your heart and you're using them. And this is devastating. This is, getting served the divorce papers. This is the adult child that's writing back to you. This is like deep, damaging, devastating kind of things that happen when you look back. This is the breakup, right? This is those things. This is being fired from your job because somehow we didn't have a moment where we came face to face with greediness in our hearts. Or there'll be something that breaks out that lodged greediness in our hearts, and you will grow as a human. You will grow as a person. You'll grow as a follower of Christ. And there's going to be something that you begin to think, maybe it's not all about me. And maybe everything isn't around my life just to fuel my life. And I want to give you an action. I want to give you a habit that will allow you to be that kind of person, that will allow you to grow as this kind of human. Here's what Jesus tells us to do. You can't just make a resolution. You just can't pray the magic prayer. You got to do something. And here's what he says to do. Sell your possessions, verse 33. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourself that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. Man, this is something that we don't like to hear because we kind of say, okay, what does that mean? That seems really extreme. So either I spend all of my money on myself or I give all of my money away. And so we just ignore this truth. And sometimes I think we just want to ignore it because we don't want to figure out what the implications are behind it. But I need you to understand that giving is what renders greed powerless. That when you give, you punch greed in the throat. Like seriously, like this, you do damage to greed when you give. It is powerless for you. It's tearing down idols. Giving away money disrespects the power of money. You need to disrespect money. You need to straight up tell money, I disrespect you. And that's a powerful moment in your life. See, here's what Jesus is saying. I want you to reallocate the things from your kingdom to my kingdom. I want you to sell some of your stuff. I want you to give some of your stuff away. I want you to make a decision to take some of your stuff and send it somewhere outside of you. For you to be able to say, I'm not going to make me the primary recipient of my money. I'm going to send that first and foremost out of my kingdom to God's kingdom. And here's what happens. Your heart will follow, I promise you. I promise you, I've seen this over and over in my life. I've seen it in the lives of people, that people all of a sudden become new people when they begin to give. And there's never remorse over giving. I've never heard someone say, I'm so bummed that I gave this money away. There's this freedom that is experienced right on the other side of this. It is liberating. It removes, I'll be happy when I get blank. It removes that. It liberates us. It frees our heart. And so why? Why should we be generous? Why should we be people that give our stuff away, that disrespect money? Here's the thing. And I think that we really need to get into this and understand, because we can look at this statement and say, okay, well, the first thing, it says, sell your stuff, give your stuff away. But oftentimes, if we just take that, there's this religious gospel that says that God, you need to be generous or God is going to get you. And that's that, I've got to be good enough, I've got to do this because God's going to get me. And that's part of God's command to us, but there's more than that. The social gospel says this, that you have to be generous because all the poor people, right? So you need to figure out how can you have all these riches when there's all these people that don't have that? Don't you feel guilty about that? That's the social gospel. And again, part of the gospel, but not the whole gospel, because that's not the only reason for us to live generous lives. The prosperity gospel says this. There's all kinds of churches that have become massive because they take this idea, which is true but not complete in Scripture, that you have to be generous because it's a better investment. That if you are to be generous towards God, what happens is He is generous back to you, right? If you give to God, you can't ever outgive God, right? So He will return, in return, He will bless you. Now, there's some stuff that we see in the Scripture that's true, but if that is the reason, if any one of those is the reason, it really puts us out of whack. Let me tell you the reason. This is the reason that we give generously and live promiscuously generous lives is this, because we have been given this incredible, incredible grace. The gospel of grace is what motivates our generosity, for us to be able to be people that take and extend the gospel. And here's what this means. As we begin to, maybe you've been around church and heard these kind of acronyms for grace. God's riches at Christ's expense. I mean, we're talking about money language, right? These riches and expense. And in this, I want us to understand the difference. Our idols tell us this. I know I'm okay because of blank, of whatever it is, because of my image, or I'm well-liked, or I have status, or I have power, security, all these possessions. But here's what will happen. Those treasures, when they become your God, they will run your life. And they will demand of you, and they will demand of your resources being fed. And they will demand that you sacrifice for them. They will demand that you will die for them, that you sacrifice these relationships for them. So it has to be about you, right? Everything has to fuel this, right? Because you are sacrificing all the relationships, all the things that are intangible in your life, because they're these things that you've put up as idols. Your idols demand that you sacrifice to them. Here's the difference. Jesus is the only treasure that is sacrificed for you. In this, Jesus is the one who paid the price for you. See, Jesus came from heaven. It cost him his glory. He had everything. It had all incredible, right? As we begin to understand the cost of Jesus coming to earth, it's just overwhelming. We see that Jesus goes to the cross. By going to the cross, he loses his Father. In fact, he's sent to hell. Like, this is this idea of the cost of what it took. Jesus lives a perfect life, is beaten and crushed for our sins, for the things that we did wrong, for our part in this. So when we live this idea of being entitled, I need us just to be clear that what we're entitled to is not the stuff that God has given us. What we're entitled to is the wrath of people who've rebelled against God. But instead of getting what we deserve, we were given grace. And Jesus comes to heaven. What does he not have in heaven? He doesn't have you and I. He doesn't have us. Jesus comes because we are his treasure. Jesus comes to love us selflessly, fully, ridiculously, promiscuously, right? This is the kind of love that Jesus begins to display to us. And this is the kind of stuff that I hope melts your heart when you begin to fathom a Savior who loved you enough to sacrifice it all, to pay what was needed to love you in an extravagant way. Because here's the thing that I hope begins to melt our heart, is that we begin to experience the grace and the sacrifice that we are Jesus' treasure. And that we understand that when we have become Jesus, when we understand that we're Jesus' treasure, it's so easy for us to give him ours. For us to say, man, it just becomes very, very easy for us to say, Jesus, I want to give you what you richly deserve. Not the social gospel, not the religious gospel, not prosperity gospel, but the gospel of grace. Saying Jesus came and took my place on the cross. And this motivates the generous heart. That motivates me to be able to live towards others in ways that bless them in a significant way. So here's something that I hope we begin to understand. That this is for your good. This is not something that I want from you. This is something I want for you. Now, have you ever seen a radically generous person who is sad? Have you ever seen a radically generous person who is unsatisfied? Conversely, have you ever seen an envious person? Have you ever seen a greedy person that didn't just have these eyes and this darkness that kind of surrounded them? Never happy, always wanting more. This is what I want from you. This is the hope that I have for you, that Jesus Christ and his generosity would radically change the way that you would see the world around you. And instead of being entitled and consumeristic, that you would shift the narrative and that you would be a giver, not a taker. And that those around you would be blessed by you saying, I've been given much, so I want to live my life as someone who is giving and not as someone who's taking. I promise you, if you do that, you will be rich.